I won't hold you to it, you see. I will just start introducing it. You go and have your pee, Lukino.
Okay.
Don't pee long. Okay. Now, is this working? Let me see. We are alive. Oh, we're live on heaven knows what we started with there. But Luca Lampariello was just on talking to me at the Polyglot Conference, and he's agreed to stay on for this live. Well, as long as he's got time to stay on for this live, which I think is quite exciting because Luca is a good friend of mine and we've been in touch for many years. And so it's always really, really cool to talk to him and to get his point of view and thoughts on anything to do with language. So today we are going to talk about language etiquette. And the reason for this topic is because I shared something on Twitter. Hey, Lucino. I shared something on Twitter recently. Well, actually last night or this today. I can't even remember now, but very recently anyway. I shared something on Twitter and it was somebody holding a placard to say speak English. And I found it on an Instagram channel where it raises the issue of when you go somewhere and people speak back to you in English. Now, this is often English, but it could be other languages too. But the important thing is it's not the language of the country where you are, and it's not the language you're trying to learn. And these people apparently can speak the language that you're trying to learn. Now, I wanted to sort of address some of the comments and questions surrounding this, which I found particularly interesting on Twitter. It turned into quite the discussion, and just to have a talk about language etiquette generally. So as far as I'm concerned, when it comes to languages, if somebody is in my country and they approach me on the street and speak my language, and I then just ignore what they've just said and just reply to them in their language because I denote, I understand the accent and where it's from and I speak the language. From my point of view, that would be quite rude. And I'll tell you why. Because the person's potentially spent money to be in the country where I speak that language and it's the language of the country and they're focusing on learning it. And they've invested time and energy and they've studied the language and they're trying their best to speak. Now, there are a couple of things that I can do. One is hear a Spanish accent, for example, and say, well, okay, my Spanish is probably going to be better than your English, so I'll just speak to you in Spanish. But what does that do? It gives the message to the person who's asking me the question in English. Your effort's not worthwhile. Let's just speak Spanish. It's quicker and easier for me and for you, and let's get the job over and done with. That would be a very, very sad example of human communication. And I would much prefer, even if my Spanish is better than their English and it would be faster, I'd much prefer to speak in English to them because they've made the effort. The other thing is that if I do that, then they have a positive experience of the country, of the language, and of me as an individual because I've taken the time to speak. Now, if the argument comes out, well, if it's quicker and easier, why don't you just go to the language that's quicker and easier? Well, I had this argument as a thing suggested at a conversation I had in Poland with a Lithuanian speaker who said that in Lithuania, they would very often speak back in English to people who spoke what they deemed as poor Lithuanian or accented Lithuanian or Lithuanian that they struggled a little bit with. They understood it, but they'd speak English to make their other people's lives easier. And my retort to that was, that's not your decision to make. That's their decision to make. If they don't understand you, they can revert to another language that you might speak. If they ask you a question in the language, it's in your country, they're asking in your language. The kindest and most sort of politest things to do is to respond just in your own language naturally. If they don't understand, that's their problem. It's not your problem as the speaker on the street. And what I mean by that is, if they didn't understand it, part of the learning process for them might be going to several people and repeating the same question over and over again until they start making sense of the language, understanding some visual cues, some other cues that the person gives you. and they will then start to improve and understand the language. So my thought on this is that language etiquette really is determined by where you are and who you are and what the goals are for the people involved in the interaction. There are going to be exceptions to that general rule of somebody asking for, directions on the street, things that are not super important. They're trying out the language, or in a bar or in a restaurant. Things could be busy, but if they don't understand, it's for the person speaking to change the language if they really want the service more or the answer more than they want the practice. Now, there are exceptions to all of this. One major exception is if you're in a plurilingual environment where people may not speak or like speaking a particular language, they may revert to another auxiliary language because they feel more comfortable themselves. Now, this can definitely happen in places like the Balkans, where you could speak a given language to somebody, thinking it's, okay, the national language. But if they don't feel comfortable in that language, they may revert to another language. And as a learner, you may not be aware of those issues. So the etiquette goes both ways. We do not know necessarily what they can do. Now, there are a couple of ways you can, and I saw a lot of very inventive ways as how you can get people to speak in the language that you want to practice. One is that you can potentially pretend not to speak English or the other language they're trying to use. That can come a little bit undone quite quickly, but you could try it. The other thing that I saw mentioned was just keeping speaking in the language. And some people had really good experiences where they'd be in a French cafe, they'd speak in French, the waiter or server would speak back in English, and then they'd carry on French and English, French and English, French and English, and they got the job done and it didn't really matter. The third thing that you can do if you're a little bit mean, and it's something that I do, so I'm going to admit to being a bit mean sometimes, is I'll tilt my head and go, like I've not really quite understood what they said, so that they revert back to the language that you're trying to speak. And as I said, it's a little bit mean, but it often works actually in a number of scenarios. So if you want to do that and you don't want the confrontation and you don't want any ill feeling, it's often the easiest way to do it. Lucino,
Richard,
what do you think about this? Have you ever had that experience where you've been in a situation speaking a language, somebody wants to they just speak another language that's an auxiliary language, whether it's English or another one?
Yeah, all sorts of things have happened in my life. All sorts of things. It really, you were putting this, you were framing this in a very nice way. It depends on a number of things. It depends on you. It depends on the situation. It depends on the speaker. But ultimately, it's up to you to decide how to handle this. I would start with saying that one thing that has happened or happens very often is with people who want to learn, who speak English quite well, they tend to switch to English very quickly, especially in Holland or in Sweden. And that's kind of, when people ask me what language is Swedish difficult to learn, I think Swedish is not that difficult to learn, but it's not easy to speak, unless, of course, you have a tutor. Even with friends, I found myself speaking Swedish, but most of the time we switch also to English, even if I think I speak Swedish flytande or fluently. But what happens is that, for example, English, when we are among friends, it's very rude to speak a language that others do not understand. Recently, I'll tell you something that happened 2 weeks ago. I recently found myself with, sitting on a table. My Ukrainian friend, she was sitting next to me, and on the other side, I had a French guy. It was a friend of a friend, and the French guy didn't speak any English. And the Ukrainian girl, she didn't speak. She didn't want to. She was continuing. She kept speaking Russian with me, and the guy phased out. So it was just kind of a mess. I said, okay, what language? We can't speak English because, she doesn't speak French. He doesn't speak Russian. So there's a number of situations happen to me, whether it's just talking to a person or, being in a group where people speak different languages but don't have a language in common. I remember two Norwegian friends, they got so mad at me and my friend for speaking Italian. But for us Italians, speaking Italian is just a way of life. It's not just speaking the language. It's like when I'm with my friend, I can't, it's just weird to speak English with my friend for others to understand. I know that this is not the way it's supposed to be within an international environment, but that's what happens. Italians, the French, and the Spaniards tend to do this all the time. They don't speak English with, like, let's suppose that I have an Italian friend. I don't speak English. Well, with friends who can speak English, we do tend to speak English, but it's very unnatural. We have to make an effort. Well, for two Norwegians talking to each other and with a French friend, for example, totally normal to speak English without a problem. And I've seen you, my friend, in Poland when we were in Poznan. I saw that, for example, you tend to want to speak the language at all costs, not at all costs, but yeah, I would say at all costs. You push it, you push through. Something I really admire about Richard, by the way, is the fact that he is fearless, you know. And this is something I have even after, I don't know, 30 years of learning languages. When I still do not speak the language, at least at B1 level, I don't like speaking, especially interacting in restaurants and stuff. Richard just goes for it. Doesn't matter if, okay, the person answers in Polish, that's great. He keeps going, the conversation going. If they're replying in English, and I've seen that happen as well, because some people, it's their choice to how to decide that. Sometimes they just want to practice their English or whatnot. Richard keeps going, keeps at it. So it really depends on you as a speaker, but if you stumble upon someone who doesn't want to speak their target language, I mean, that's fine. It recently happened to me in Hungary. I was speaking Hungarian. The guy could understand very well. This happened with a guy on the street and a girl who was cutting my hair. And I was speaking Hungarian, and she replied in English all the time. That's fine. She understood me. I didn't get offended, but just, you know, she wanted to practice her English. That's fine, you know. But you will meet a lot of different people reacting and acting in different ways. It really depends on the circumstances, you, the person, your mood, the time, the circumstances, other people. So it's very interesting.
Yeah, there are a lot of things mixed up in and how you react to this. And as you say, different people will speak in different ways. And Chanel says, you know, she's had this issue where she'll get certain people who will just constantly correct everything to the point that she feels she can't even get a sentence out, and that is frustrating as well. So it's kind of almost the other end of the scale, right, of this, just a barrage of corrections until everything's perfect.
You know, Richard, this reminds me of, in particular, of one person. I can't say the name, but there's one specific person who corrected my Hungarian all the time, so much so, in fact, that I didn't want to talk to him in Hungarian anymore. Hungarian, H, because it backfires. You know, I believe that error correction is great when you know the person, you have agreed that it would help you. But if someone corrects you every time you open your mouth, it backfires. It's useless. You don't remember the corrections because you're in for the communication. And on top of that, you find it very irritating that the person somehow subconsciously or consciously is trying to tell you, send you the message that they're better than you are somehow for whatever reason. And but this I'm pretty sure, Richard, that as nice as you are, as nice as I am, hopefully, there are some people on our path who are not going to be very nice to us when you would try to speak the foreign language. It's a fact of life that you have to accept. Awkward situations and sometimes nasty people. The silver lining of this is the good piece of news is that there's not a lot of them, but unfortunately they do exist. And the more you practice, the more you get out there, you're bound to, you know, to meet these people, and then you have to learn how to react in that situation.
Absolutely. And I think this idea of correction and overcorrection and is also something to do with you know, language etiquette and not allowing somebody to speak is akin to just speaking over them constantly as well. And I think maybe it's an issue with social interactions as well, essentially, and not just linguistic reasons for doing it. Also, it's kind of not knowing what the or understanding that there needs to be a give and a take in the conversation for it to move forwards. Otherwise, you just end up stalling the whole experience for everyone in the end. So yeah, Chanel, I can absolutely identify with that issue, and I'm sorry that happens to you. My solution for you, though, if you want sort of advice on what to do in those situations, is to actually talk about it, to open up a discussion. And if they're doing it and they speak a language that you are confident in, and are confident you're not going to make the mistakes in, or even in the language that you're trying to speak with the mistakes, is to say, just wait 1 second, let me finish my thought, and let me just say that I really appreciate that you want me to speak this language really, really well. I can see it's important to you. I can see it means a lot to you that I get the correction so that I can improve. For me, there's a balance, and learning to say this type of thing in your own words to make it authentic, not in mine, obviously, is really important, because then you communicate that you appreciate that they're trying to do something from a good point of view. And let's look on the bright side and say that they are. And what you're doing is you're acknowledging that and kind of thanking them for it, but also putting a measuring stick against what they're doing and what you need as an individual and as a learner. And then you can go on to say, you know, I'm still learning the language, and clearly you can hear my mistakes. Let's say that if you hear the same mistake 5 times during the conversation, then maybe raise it then. But what we do is we also allow me to try and get my thoughts together, because part of the language learning is not just getting the grammar and everything perfectly correct. It's also just getting one's thoughts out in a different language, with different vocabulary, with different grammatical rules. And when you mix all of that together, even sometimes when you know the language better than maybe you feel you're displaying at any given time, you sort of stall in the speaking. You feel that you can't say it in a fluid or fluent manner. And so expressing that to the person often is normally enough to sort of help to reduce that issue. If they say to you, no, I'm not going to do that, I'm going to just keep correcting you, then I'd say find another speaking partner, to be honest. At that point, you probably don't want to be speaking to them anyway, because they're not going to be understanding for anything else that you want to talk about. You're not on the same wavelength. I hope that helps as a solution for you as well. And I'm glad Luca could you know, share his experience with this, because it is all of us that experience this. This is definitely the issue, right?
Yeah, unfortunately. Well, fortunately, it's a minority. The overwhelming majority of people are pretty nice. So, but when it happens, you have to just to know that there are people who, for whatever reason, they want to put you down, or they're not, maybe so they're a little bit socially awkward, but you can take it in stride, you know.
Absolutely. Yeah. Sonia, you raised a really interesting point here. You said, I think that the problem can be exacerbated if you are not the right race or background. People may not believe that you can do it. That is a really, really good thing to raise, because your packaging, how you appear to the people you're speaking to, definitely, absolutely, without any shadow of a doubt, plays a part to how they react to you. There's just no question. And that is not just your skin color, your facial features, it's also your gender, it's your demeanor, it's what clothes you're wearing. It's so many things that come into play when you talk to somebody from a different culture and you're trying to speak the language, and they will react to you in a way that that is from their perspective, individually or culturally, and so you definitely do have some issues with that. And you will see, for example, some really funny funny examples of white Japanese people or black Japanese people who are speaking in a restaurant. You can find these on YouTube, and the server will come over to the table and look at the people who look like they're from Asia, like from that part of Asia, and talk to them even though they can't speak Japanese, and completely ignore the people who don't look Japanese. And even though they're speaking the language flawlessly because they grew up there, they were born there, they're from there. And it is interesting because there can be a mental block if people are not used to certain people who look a certain way speaking a certain language. I mean, we don't have this with English in the same way because English is spoken by so many people, but I have definitely noticed it in other societies, and you're completely right. And as a learner, as hard as it is to say, we almost to a degree need to help break the mold and recognize that our role actually there is helping to break the mold. You may be the first person that looks the way you do in your form, in your body, that they perceive as the first person ever to speak the language that you're trying to speak. So they've got a really big hill to climb when it comes to getting over the shock factor of this. And whether we like it or we don't like it is almost not relevant to the fact that that's what the status is. And what we can do is talk to them about it and raise the awareness. I mean, I've lost count how many people have asked me in the Balkans if I can read Cyrillic. And even though I'm speaking to them fluently in the local language, they will say to me, do you want the menu in English or, you know, and I look and I say, well, I speak the local, you know, I speak the language, whether it's Macedonian or Serbian, this happens. And sometimes they look at me like a cat has just spoken instead of meow. And honestly, and sometimes I kind of laugh and I say, well, I'm speaking the language, so yeah, I'm fine. And then sometimes they say, well, can you read the language? And I look and I say, are you asking me if I'm illiterate? and to which that's a really offensive thing to say to somebody. So they kind of backtrack very quickly when I say that. And then they just bring me the menu. But it's something that I think many of us come across depending on the language we're learning and where we are and the people we meet, and also what part of the country as well can be quite important. Have you ever had that, Luca, where somebody's just sort of not been able to get over the fact that you're Italian?
Yeah, it happened quite a few times, especially from Americans. Get reactions like, "You speak English very well. Why?" And I just go like, "Well, when they tell me you're Italian, but you speak English well, why?" So they were kind of surprised that as an Italian, I speak English or any other language well. But going back to what you were saying, Richard, I want to tell you something really funny that happened to me, and this talks about speaks volume of the cultural misunderstandings or the complexity of human interaction across cultures. I was in Brussels. It was 2011, and I was with a bunch of friends, and also with Luca Toma, whom you know. Luca Toma is a good friend of mine, and he's a Japanese instructor. He lived 10 years in Japan, so he knows the ins and outs of the culture. He lived it, He lived in the country. I was talking to this Japanese guy. I think we were speaking in English, and all of a sudden, this Japanese guy just does this, closes his eyes, and I thought maybe this guy's not interested. He's falling asleep. And actually, Luca was just sitting next to me, was suggesting to me that it's a way of expressing the fact that you're paying particular attention to what your interlocutor, whatever he's saying. And so I didn't understand that, and I understood it thanks to Luca's intervention. Another thing the Japanese normally do is that when we talk, normally there's I speak and you're not speaking. And in Japanese, you have to produce sounds in order to tell your interlocutor that you're listening, like all the time. So this is another thing that I didn't know. And I was in Paris and I was observing this Japanese girl taking this call, and she was like every 2 seconds. And we don't do that. In Europe, we don't do that. No. So when you talk, it's rude to produce sounds when the other person is talking. So just to give you a couple of examples of the amazing things I've discovered within the Japanese culture. I have so many other episodes and so many interesting stories, but in general, going back to what you were saying, human interaction is more complex than you think. The brain automatically, when you meet a person, scans the person physically. You have a lot of biases with you. So where is that person from? What do they believe in? This is, sometimes it's run automatically in the back of your mind. You don't realize that. Even how you yourself react to that person. Sometimes for example, it's not just how people react, but how you react if someone comes to you and tries to speak, I don't know, Italian. Let's suppose that someone comes to you, for example, and speaks your own language, but very, very poorly, So what do? Do you reply in the language? Let's say an American who comes and says, do we have forno? He tries to say, oh, where is this shop? And he can barely put a sentence together. What do? Is it rude to reply in English to help him? Sometimes you might get offended that people reply in another language, but they're in their mind, they're trying to help you. So there's so many different things and misunderstandings. What do you do, Richard, when someone comes to you and speaks very broken English? But you can immediately tell because of their accent. I'm pretty sure you can recognize it. Someone comes and oh, this person comes from. What I do is like, are you from there? Are you from this country? And boom, I speak their language. Oh wow,
Yeah, so I mean, it does, and this is where I always assume it's coming from a good place when people do this, and the language etiquette thing is something I think for me it's just a kind of a steady rule that I have that I know can move as well. But yeah, absolutely. I mean, some people do it, and I've come across people where I remember in London once, this lady got off the bus and she was with a daughter. And she had a very thick Spanish accent when she spoke in English and wanted to know where something was, but she was doing it in English and she was struggling, but she was doing it. I just listened and she couldn't quite follow some of it. And I just said in English, if you want, I also speak Spanish, but I'm also happy to continue in English. And I offered in English. I didn't offer in Spanish. And and she said, she actually accepted my offer of speaking Spanish, but and I carried on then and just explained it in Spanish. And she was very, very kind and very nice and enjoyed the sort of the short chat we had as well attached to it, because obviously wasn't really expecting me to speak Spanish on the street. But there are other people where I've just carried on and look, this is where I say, it's not my problem if the person is trying my language and doesn't understand me. This is part of their learning process. And I can't take ownership of them not understanding me in that kind of situation. If they're in a situation where it's my job, obviously I have to take some ownership and responsibility. But if it's in a street environment and I'm in a rush somewhere and I'm talking to them, I will stand and help if I can. And as far as I'm concerned, if that's not worked, they have got a gazillion other people in a place like London to choose from to ask again. It's not like they're sort of left stranded. So this is where I think there needs to be a kind of a measure as to what you do as a speaker, and then also what you expect as a learner and how you tackle this. So if you see that somebody's in the street and really rushing, but they've stopped for a second to help you, and then they switch languages, well, take the situation into account as well. Do they really have time to start speaking slowly to help you in the other language, or do you just go to the next person to practice? This is where we kind of have to use a little bit of what we always talk about common sense in the UK, and common sense is actually I've come to not like it so much, but as an expression, because common sense doesn't make much sense actually, because what common sense is for one person is not for another person. But I think using a measuring stick as to what the situation is, and then trying to understand the whole of what's going on, then having a reaction to it is the important thing.
Yeah. I think it depends on your experience. The more experiences you have with foreigners, the more you understand personally, how you can act and react in certain situations. Sometimes, actually, most of the time, the fact that you speak their language, it is not about them wanting to practice a language with you, but you speaking that language can change things dramatically. Let me give you an example. 2 years ago, because of the pandemic, everything was closed. It was very difficult to do anything. And I was at the supermarket just around the street, and I saw a couple, a girl and a guy, and they were panicking. And they couldn't communicate with the people who were at the supermarket. And they were trying to speak, the Italians couldn't speak English. And then these people, I just asked them, where are you from, in English, something that I hope everybody understands. And they told me, Magyarország. So they told me, we're from Hungary. Boom. So I was super happy, and I started speaking Hungarian. I explained to them how to get the tickets, because they were panicking about not being able to get, here in Italy, you cannot buy, strangely enough, you cannot buy a ticket on the bus. So you had to go somewhere. It was Sunday. Everything was closed because of the pandemic. And I helped them. I gave them the tickets at the end. I said, well, just take it, the fact that I was explaining this in Hungarian, they couldn't believe it. They found a guy who was speaking Hungarian who gave them the 2 tickets they needed, and they couldn't find it. That made my day. So yeah. Sometimes it's not about, people trying to practice the language. Sometimes people can speak the language, and they just, when they see someone who speaks their own language in another country, because you have to consider also where you are, then it just changes everything. And I wanted to tell you one more thing before I go, because unfortunately I have to go. Something that happened to me in Warsaw. Now, Warsaw is kind of a cosmopolitan city, and young people tend to speak English, but some people don't, even if they were in their 30s or 40s, right? So this is something I do all the time, and everybody asks me why. So that's the opposite of you. You just, when you're in Poland, you just like speak Polish. And now that I speak fluent Polish, I have no problem doing what I can do everything in Polish. But I like, when I have my haircut, I like speaking English at the beginning, and they're in for a little surprise at the end. So normally when I am in Krakow, and this happened quite a few times, I happen to talk, for example, last time I talked to a person from Donetsk, the eastern part of Ukraine, and from other parts of Ukraine in particular, because where I go, they always speak, in particular, Russian, especially Russian, also Ukrainian. I always start in English. They're super shy. They don't talk much, just cut my hair. When they start speaking Russian after 10 minutes, they tell me the story of their lives. Like literally, it changes everything. They tell me about their family, why they moved to Krakow, et cetera, et cetera. So this has been happening over the last 2 years. It's a surprise towards the end. In Warsaw in particular, I had, for the first time in my life, a girl cutting my hair. This is not common in Italy. I don't know, maybe it's common in the UK, but girls don't cut guys' hair in Italy. It's just like, girls cut, at least as far as I'm concerned, is what I've seen. This girl was super shy. We were speaking English at the beginning for some 25 minutes. She cut my hair for around 30 minutes. The last 5 minutes, I started speaking. I opened my mouth and I started speaking Polish. She was like so shocked. She asked me first, why don't you speak Polish in the first place, right? Why? And then she changed from like very serious and very concentrated. She opened up. She told me about it. I'm shy in English. So, when the thing I wanted to say is that when you see people on the street, and sometimes they look like they're a little bit either shy, or they don't want to talk to you, or they look cold, it's because they're scared. When you speak because they're scared of using the language, they're insecure. When you speak their own native language, they open up. And this is a beautiful sign that human beings are warm inside, maybe cold outside a little bit, but if you just speak their language, especially when they don't speak any other language or are insecure about using English, worlds open up. That's the beauty of language learning. When I go to Poland, I talk to taxi drivers who talk to me about life. These are the things, among many other things, that is really, really worth speaking a foreign language. It's just, you see worlds that you would not be seeing if you could speak just one language. And I wanted to end, as far as I'm concerned, with this philosophical note,
I love that story, Luca, and you're completely right. People have their own things and their own experiences and things going on. So we go with our own unique experience, and they're also coming with their unique experiences. And I think also for many people, they use English because the vast majority of people that go to a country, actually just want to get things done and communicate.
Yes.
The language learning element is actually quite small. So if you think 99% of the people that one individual will speak to on the street who's saying a couple of words in the language actually can't wait for the person to switch to English or another language. And then you may be just the 1% that doesn't want that and feels bad about it or embarrassed or hurt or something. But actually, for that other person, they didn't mean anything by it. It's just usually that's what they do. And
Exactly right.
taking into account how other people feel and think, just taking a breath and taking a step back, it just helps you to really appreciate that there's another dynamic going on there. Luca, thank you for staying for so long and for joining me on this live as well. It's been.
We have to do it. We have to do it again. I've been thinking anyway of doing a multilingual chat with you live. We will do this. It's gonna happen. So if Richard wants to do this as well, we're gonna have fun. Certo, Luchino. Richard, you're the man. Bye, everyone. Have a fantastic Sunday, and as always, happy language learning from me. And I will see you soon on YouTube and on the other channels, possibly with Richard.
Fortissimo abbraccio, Luchino. Ciao, ciao, ciao. So, I mean, I'm really, really glad that Luca could make it and to answer some of the questions that you had as well. I want to get back to some of the questions that we've got in the chat because I think that there are some really interesting ones there to take on that are related to etiquette. Will and Yvonne Morton say, what about the issue of cultural appropriation? I find as an English speaker in the US that if I try to speak Spanish, I sometimes get a reaction that seems to indicate they don't want me to speak their language. Now, this is a really good question, and the US is a very specific case when it comes to these discussions of language, culture, race, and cultural appropriation as a term. It's not something that every country in the world has as a term. It's a very North American and I would say Western European concept in the first instance. It does happen in other places as well. There could be many reasons why that has happened to you. And this is where I would go back to the idea of etiquette and language etiquette. The people you're talking to or trying to talk to in Spanish may actually not have been born in a Spanish-speaking country, or even speak Spanish at home with family members that do speak Spanish or with other people. They may mix Spanish and English or just use English. And so they may not feel so confident. So it's taking on board as well how they feel in their background. And we just don't know that. So, I mean, we can adapt. Whenever I've been to the US myself, I have used Spanish and English. And I think potentially because I don't have an American accent in either, I have a European accent in both Spanish and English. I've never come across any problems whatsoever in terms of this. But I think that if you're from the United States and you do this, then that can also be an extra layer. So it's always good to sort of to talk through. It's this, when you're in a country where there's a default language or in an area where there's default language, then it's always good to kind of talk around it first and to see where people feel and where they are with it. If we dive straight in, we don't know where the cultural and linguistic sensitivities may lie. And so that can be a danger zone area where it becomes that people can have a negative reaction to what you perceive and what your intentions are as being a positive interaction or wanting a positive interaction. But that could be because they're coming from a very different place. They may have been, teased. They may have had other issues in their past. They may have some trauma attached to certain things. And we just don't know. Individuals have very different things going on. So going in easy is probably a good way of dealing with that. Usually my litmus test in the US is if I hear, for example, people speaking in Spanish, I don't disrupt the flow by going in and speaking English. I'll speak Spanish. But if I don't hear them speaking Spanish, I don't assume that I can then speak to them in Spanish. I will usually use English as the default. That's in the US for me. The question of cultural appropriation, I think, well, first of all, we need to define what cultural appropriation is. And I think that is when you take elements of a culture and you try to use it as your own. You maybe don't give credit for the culture. And so for example, I don't know, it could be many things, but it's usually from a culture that's seen as a culture that's imposed itself on another culture, and it just takes and makes it its own, without the recognition for the original culture that it's from. When it comes to language learning, this is where I think doing your best to represent the language faithfully can be important. Also, being respectful of the language and the community that speaks it. For the most part, the language communities that I've come across have always been very accepting and happy to have somebody learning the language. The key thing that I find, and I have come across people who have gone into language communities and sort of they run their mouths off about what they think about the language. They judge it, all the judgments from their own culture, and what they like, what they don't like, anything and everything. I've also met people who want to divorce the language from the culture, particularly when this is an endangered, vulnerable or indigenous language. This is a really risky thing to do, and also quite disrespectful, because doing that as a learner isn't really letting the voice of the community be heard, and so that's where I think there could be, with language learning, a degree of cultural appropriation. I wouldn't say cultural, but linguistic appropriation, taking the language out of its cultural context, and that is problematic as a thing to do. And I have unfortunately witnessed people doing that in language communities, and it makes me feel quite uncomfortable. Instead, I think what we need to do is recognize that languages, particularly ones that are not studied as commonly, like the indigenous, endangered, and vulnerable language categories, is to go into that language, into the culture, and see how it's used on their terms, and see where the boundaries are for those cultures and how you're using it. I think listening a lot is really important to what those people have to say in the first instance, and then using it in a respectful way is something that I don't think we can define as cultural appropriation or even linguistic appropriation if we're doing it with that background. Now, there will be communities where they do not want outsiders speaking their languages, and that's their right as a linguistic community. And so we don't have to understand that, and we don't have to agree with that as individuals. But if that's what they want, that's what they want. And so there is a point where I think we need to accept. Whether we agree or disagree is by the by. Just accepting that is the case that's the case. For the majority of languages that are commonly studied, though, what I've found is many of them actually far beyond just having people integrate and understand the culture and get to know the culture and the people and learn the language and try to represent it in the way that it's used by those communities. Actually, some of them find it quite fun, and when you start playing with the language and integrate your own things, and I've definitely had that myself, where I've played with language because I come from a different mindset, I come from a different linguistic mindset, a different culture, and so sometimes I will see language in a way that the language community wouldn't see it, and I'll play with the language in a way that they might not necessarily play with it. But again, it's in interactions with them on their terms. So even then, it's not me saying, okay, this is how you do something, or this is how you play with the language, or this is a word that I've created and you should all use this now. No, by far from that. This is showing an appreciation for the language, for the culture, and on terms that they agree with. And I think when you speak to different people, you'll get a feeling for that within these linguistic communities quite quickly. And things can change, and one person may have one idea on this, another may have another. But there is a very clear distinction to be made between cultural or linguistic appropriation and cultural or linguistic appreciation. And I think they're two very different things. And so what I'm talking about in my business is in this side, the appreciation, not the appropriation, because that's not giving the nod to the culture, to the language, to the people, whereas this is engaging on their terms, and that's the appreciation of it. And feeling part of something. Appropriation, people don't feel part of it. They just take and grab what they want and use it for their own means. Appreciation, you get involved and you have a feeling for all of this as well within a community, and you ask and you have honest conversations. So yeah, I hope that helps as a sort of an answer to that question. I know it's quite a challenging topic in the US particularly, and in probably actually Canada, I'm going to put in the same bracket. North America, this is quite a difficult topic, and I would definitely be happy to read thoughts and views on this. I'm always happy to learn and to stay open to other opinions on these kinds of things. So Teresa, yes, thank you for thanking me for this topic of language etiquette. And I think all of this actually, appreciation and cultural appropriation, it also falls within this etiquette thing, right? All of this comes together. Let's see. Okay, so Teresa says that they would usually use the etiquette of using the language, but let them practice English actually with them, because some people say that they work in some of these touristy areas on purpose to practice their English, and therefore showing linguistic etiquette is speaking to them in English because that's what they've chosen to do. And I think that's fair enough. This is where I think that you know, where we take the surroundings and take the environment, and we're conscious of the whole and not just the sort of the detail. So I think that's absolutely right. Yeah, there are certain scenarios where, for example, I will do that too if I recognize that even within a country, I'm in a situation where it would actually be rude for me to speak the language that we share, and even if I speak it very, very well, I would choose to speak another language because that's the right thing to do at that time. So, for example, if I were to go into a class and let's say it was an English class, for example, and I speak the first language, or the first language of the person who's there, and we're in that country. If it's in an English class, particularly in front of the students, but even if it's not, for me not to speak English to that English teacher would be a bit of a snub, and so I wouldn't do that to people. If we're in that context, I would definitely speak in English, and I think that it's important to do so, because otherwise it's a bit rude for me not to. And this is where the etiquette thing depends on a lot of factors. So yeah, I get that completely, Teresa. Okay. I'm trying to see if there are any other questions I have here. So super shy. So oftentimes people mistake my shyness for a lack of ability in the language. I started speaking up for myself and saying like this, wait, no, I do speak X. I'm just really shy, and I'm more quiet, and it takes time to think before I speak. And I think people usually handle that pretty well. It's a really nice phrase to use, actually. Really, really nice phrase to use. Yeah, explaining what the situation is. This is the thing, right? Dialogue is important. Communication is important, because if we can communicate to the other person, they've got a better understanding of the context of where we're coming from. We have a better idea of the context they're coming from, and we can move forward together in a positive way, whether it's we agree that, okay, on this occasion, we make a decision that they don't have time to sit there and explain things, and the information is more important, or that I need more time and they have the time to talk, or we move on to other people. And I think all of these things are really, really important. So thank you. I am going to disappear because I've got 7 minutes before the end of the Polyglot Conference, and I need to just take a quick break before that. But thank you all so much for joining me today. I really, really appreciate it. And I will keep these ways of doing the lives, actually, because I think it's a good way to get questions in real time, and also moving forward, okay, Luca was on the call today, and maybe we can do more of those kinds of things if you like that too. But we can also sort of talk to each other, and I can bring you on, and you can actually use your voice and you know, use your microphone and talk to me and have a call in like we talked about last time. So let's do that in the future. I will definitely allow you all to use your microphones moving forward as well. Thank you. Enjoy the rest of the conference if you're enjoying the conference. If you're not at the conference, you can still get a ticket and enjoy the many sessions that will carry on for language exchanges after the 9th, and also enjoy the presentations as they're recorded and processed and put up into the Saturn Theatre. But you can already access a number of those from this year and last year already. So thank you again, and